Good evening and welcome to the New School and welcome to the Transdisciplinary Lecture Seminar which is co-produced by Parsons, the Fine Arts Department at Parsons, and by the Mireles Center for Art and Politics. The topic of these lectures are art and science, and we have paired usually a scientist and an artist around shared interests or shared methodology. So over the past few weeks you've heard faculty from the New School, you've heard independent scientists, you've heard, for instance, someone from the Natural Resources Defense Council, and they have addressed notions of the environment, environmentalism, the principles of scientific inquiry, mathematics, anthropology, and in particular human and non-human animal relationships, etc. And tonight we are delighted to have Okwui Enwezor with us, who will be introduced by Andrea Geyer, who co-directs this seminar with me.
Did you all vote? Thank you. It's a great pleasure to give a short introduction to Okwui Enwezor, who's going to speak to us today. He grew up in Enugu in eastern Nigeria and moved to the US in the early 1980s to earn a BA in political science. I personally became aware of Okwui's work first through the curation of the second Johannesburg Biennale in 1997. Resisting the role of the curator as a single author, Okwui developed a complex project including different curators from around the globe to develop a set of exhibitions and a conference. The biennial addressed themes such as post-colonialism, multiculturalism, and globalization, and looked at how local subjects rub against these discourses without finding definite answers and without becoming subsumed by those particular discourses. I recognized back then, and was fascinated as a young artist, that what Okwui was suggesting was to relieve the biennial format from being a site of a simple display and a celebration of commercial Eurocentric values, and used it instead as a site of critical, contextual, and dialogical thinking. A concept that he continued in Documenta 11, in which he worked again with a team of 6 curators to develop 5 international platforms, all documented by readers that if you haven't looked at already, I highly recommend you to do so. The exhibition in Kassel, which was the 5th and last platform, invited artists there from countries that had never been represented before, opening up this historic show to reflect critically on its own limitations by suggesting a unified international experience of the documenta as an exhibition of world art in the stage of global post-colonialism. These 2 shows are just among many others, from Archive Fever, the use of document in contemporary art, to the short century, independence and liberation movements in Africa, 1945 to 1994, and global conceptualism, as well as forthcoming on governmentality, techniques and technologies of critique, dissent, resistance, and solidarity in contemporary art. His exhibition have continued to be a site for contextualizing urgent social, political, and global questions in a way that he himself described as that it's questions in which in a way that he is not so much interested in how some of these questions are set in and around themselves, but how they flow in and out of each other, oftentimes producing a quite legible disfiguration. I like that term. Okwui is also the founder and editor of the critical art journal Nka, Journal of Contemporary African Art, published by the African Studies Center at Cornell University. His writings have appeared in numerous journals, catalogs, books, and magazines, far too many to list them here. His own books are Reading the Contemporary, African Art from Theory to the Marketplace, published by MIT, and Mega Exhibitions, and Antinomies of Transnational Global Form, as well as forthcoming The Postcolonial Constellation, Contemporary Art and the Global Stage, and Archaeology of the Present, The Postcolonial Archive, Photography, and African Modernity. Please help me welcome Okwui Enwezor.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was quite extensive. And I very much appreciate the invitation to come and speak here this evening. Not least because it was an invitation by Andrea, an artist whose practice I very much admire. but also in the context of what I will call a different kind of politics of disaggregation, which is taking place today in the United States. And it's really, in my view, quite important as we go through these moments of social transformation in which various societies in transition are presently deeply engaged with, that we think about the role of art and politics not as two separate systems of understanding the present circumstances in which we live and work, or in which artists make their claims within the general dimension of the global public sphere, but also to think about the entanglement of art and politics as an opportunity for provocation, and not necessarily an opportunity for, for demagoguery. In any case, I could not think of a better artist to bring into this discussion today than the Brazilian artist Cildo Meireles. I think that his work, particularly a very specific body of work which I shall focus on this evening, this body of work, in my view, makes it possible to renew, if you will, the contact that seems, in a kind of cyclical fashion, to be severed between art and politics. And I think that Mireles offers us an important, set of theoretical and, if you will, methodological possibilities for provocation and also for crystallization. So I thank you, Andrea and Karen, for inviting me. And let me just simply begin with just a kind of brief précis on Meireles' own work. So in a monograph dedicated to his work published in 1999 by Phaidon Press, Cildo Meireles selected an excerpt from one of Jorge Luis Borges' fables, The Garden of Forking Paths, as his choice of a literary entry that accompanied the book's other more interpretive essays, which provided analysis of his career. The choice of the story is both apt and self-revealing, being as it is Meireles' recognition of the affinities his own work shares with Borges' lapidary writing on the incongruities of reality and phenomena. In the same manner, Borges' stories are labyrinthine, a phenomenological map of puns and allusions, continuities and discontinuities. So are many of Meireles' projects, particularly in large installations, such as A Través, red-shaped fonts, or small sculptures such as Espejo, which is called blind mirror. Each of these works covering distinct periods of his practice, both in their given titles and works, provide each of these works covering distinct periods of his practice, both in their given titles and the structure and phenomenological investigations they set up, are decidedly Borgesian. Most significantly, they seem to draw from Borges' manner of constructing a tale, be it tall or convoluted, as a process of discovery, in which the reader traverses the contours of the ever-unfolding story, seeking clues that nevertheless confound the standard logic of a story's narrative progression. If any intention can be read into The Garden of Forking Paths as a choice of text, it is perhaps meant to exemplify the incongruities that dot the landscapes of Meireles' own gestures and propositions. Moreover, it also stands as a kind of transparent letter for understanding the forking paths that mark the trajectory of this most unclassifiable of artists. Yet the narrative of Meireles' work is no more satisfactorily read if we were to follow the standard logic that offers an understanding of his artistic practice according to identifiable set pieces that defines a style. Therefore, for all his attempts at encyclopedic summation of Meireles' career so far, the book may find itself unable to resolve some of the paradoxes, like the shifting trajectories of Borges' writing that inhabit Meireles' ceaseless search for forms adequate to the philosophical, conceptual, spatial, and temporal character of his larger critical practice. What might a visitor find then in this exposition and expose? Perhaps what will become manifest to viewers of his artistic detours, paths taken, cut short in mid-motion, deferred, thwarted into units of both unfailing structural complexity and schematic incompleteness, or yet a fully elaborated discourse on forms and gestures that might permit a strong condensation to build, which would link the tangled paths and reveal the unifying logics and strategies of his practice. My motivation is twofold. First, I want to cast a critical look at one project, Insertions into Ideological Circuits, for which Mireles has come to be known far more than any other work of his over 40-year career. Like Borges' Forking Paths, Mireles' Insertions operate at the gap between circuits, between material flows, ideological structures, and nodes of value, symbolic, social, economic, and political. The insertions in question are as much cuts inscribed on as they are breaks struck into formal structures of power, broadcast systems and instruments of public transmission. In tactical terms, the insertions represent the brutal scoring onto the sheets of public consciousness of the wild rumors of human existence caught in the grips of unaccountable power. Thus, they are procedures of disaggregation, carefully insinuated into spheres of everyday practice, whether embodied in models of institutional totalization, for instance, in the machineries of the state and multinational capital, or in the teleological pieties of the church and family in Brazil. In seeking to analyze and attack these scenes of production, and I mean, obviously, institutions from the military dictatorship in Brazil during the 60s and 70s to global multinationals working in Latin America at this particular time. So in seeking to attack some of these scenes of production, communication, and dissemination and domination, Meireles in Insertions formulated the modalities of a counter-ideological discourse, one which through communicative action arrives at the address of its intended public by means of dispersal and detour into social structures and institutional systems. And I will come to this. I'm just sort of laying out the foundation of my larger argument. In so doing, Meireles' idea was to take possession of and to appropriate these systems, money and consumer products, as I showed, the Coca-Cola bottles, and of course, currency, money and consumer products as mediums of ideological transmission and communication within the democratic public sphere as forms of artistic and political critique of the commodity, sign, and imperialistic power. In a text reflecting the motivation behind the conception of insertions and the operative critical stakes in the work of a young third world artist, Meireles writes, and I quote, "The scenario for this text and the projects is this momentous period, the late 1960s and early 1970s, in the cultural synthesis of Western culture's industry, which impelled a Brazilian artist in his early 20s to produce work that considered the following issues. 1, the painful political, social, and economic reality of Brazil, a consequence to a large extent of 2, the American system of politics and culture and its expansionist, interventionist, hegemonic, centralizing ideology, without losing sight of 3, the formal aspect of language." So what is very important that if we cast a glance back to the late 1960s and early 70s when this was being put forward, it seems to me very interesting that the relationship between that discourse in the late 60s coming from a marginal or a supposedly marginal place in the world then, and the discussions that we are having in terms of the current, forms of political address between this country and other parts of the world. I shall not name names. It seems that very much we are sort of caught in this cycle of the return of the repressed, if you will. So these considerations offered by Meireles directs attention to my second point, which concerns the exhibitionary model of his practice of these insertions, the way that the insertions themselves are not designed for exhibition spaces, but rather are designed for public circulation through both the consumption of the commodity, in this case, the Coca-Cola bottle, which he will then imprint with a particular slogans and then return back into circulation. And when that bottle is refilled, then that's when the message on the, so to speak, message on the bottle, not in the bottle, but on the bottle is then revealed. Or in the case of the currency, that every currency, every amount of money he spends, he tries to insert a particular message that goes to the heart of what his critique was. And in this case, the question was, who killed Herzog? And Herzog at that particular time was a Brazilian journalist who had mysteriously disappeared and then was discovered dead. And I think that the question then was that this journalist was a victim of the dictatorship and all of that. So here, the exhibitionary context was not what, especially Brazilian artists of his generation, were not really trying to sort of use only display mechanisms as models of producing art or for showing art to the general public. So I want to examine how, looking back at Insertions and its intervention nearly 40 years ago into circuits of capital exemplified by American hegemonic policies around the world then, might also be linked to the historical circumstances and context in which the work first appeared. To that end, how is the use of the idea of the insertions not a way of simply looking back, but an occasion for ceaseless returns to a historical period which haunts contemporary art today? So what I'm trying to sort of to say that if we were to look at the Insertions, this particular body of work, and at the time in which it was made, and its return to public consciousness today, it might be interesting to sort of to think about how the 1960s has become a figure of reflection in the work of a lot of artists. So you think about, say, the work of somebody like Rene Green, you think about somebody like Phyllis Gmelin, and so on, that the 60s has become, I don't want to call it a style, so to speak, but there is, it seems to me, that when we think about processes of artistic radicalization, that the 60s seems to be the point where many artists return back to. So in a sense, the 60s become fetishized. So I'm trying to sort of to look at this notion of historical returns that attach both to the work itself, but also to the rhetoric of politics of disaggregation that emerged from the 60s that many artists are still very much enamored of today. So it is within this context that the issues raised by Meireles' project will become clarified. Meireles was operating under a climate of politics that demanded all kinds of formal and conceptual responses from artists, cultural practitioners, student movements, labor and civil rights organizations, and most importantly in Latin America at this particular time, guerrillas. So I want to sort of to recall, in staring back, is a recent series of photographic work comprising nearly 200 images. Chris Marker revisited some of the political concerns operative in the 1960s and the public responses to them across the world. Though the bulk of the photographs were taken in the 60s, some of the earliest images precede the period and some others are of more recent events. In this way, the project scans the landscape of political and social change in the last half century. In this assemblage of grainy black and white images, Marker employs the idea of looking back as a means of probing the vestigial, incipient moments of radical change as they were taking root in the 1960s. In the series, the gazes of the figures caught during periods of protests or marches are speckled with both anxiety and defiance. The gazes are links to past and present. They offer not so much a testimonial as much as they remind us that retrospectives are modes of narration. Here, the contemporary becomes a site of ceaseless returns. Vietnam and Iraq, Algeria and Afghanistan, France and Argentina, tracing the roots of the internecine discourses of migration and immigration, crime and punishment, illegality, and the struggles for recognition, race and identity, terror, nihilism, incarceration. These are the watchwords familiar to the retrospective gazes found in these images. We stare, they stare back, but these are not looks into the abyss, into the bottomless pits of the historical past. Retrospectives are necessarily about historical returns. They are about circuits in which the indelible marks of everyday experience become reanimated in the present. In museum practice, such returns are themselves a curatorial medium, such as I've mentioned. Meireles' retrospective is surely the scene of reappraisals, returns to circuits of production, thinking, and action. No less enamored of such historical returns is the manner his artistic projects and objects of social and aesthetic analysis organize thought, inform discourse, and serve as critical models for a range of contemporary practices or their corollaries in present art historical production and criticism. The returns to the 1960s, the decade of infamy and rejection of the totalizing apparatus of modernity, the state, commodity, social control, and the stentorian discourses of grand narratives have become a growth industry all their own, which have proven remarkably fertile and rich for artists and emerging scholarship. The 1960s, some look back in dumb admiration, others in nostalgia, while others, especially the neoconservative forces, see the decade as a landscape of moral disaster. No recent historical period has been more earnestly analyzed for its failures, lost illusions, and unfulfilled promises than the 60s. Marker's work is exemplary then because he has made the impossible quest inherent in returns the signature element of his other works, especially in his films, such as Sans Soleil, for instance, which pursued with lyrical ambivalent ardor through the thickest and tangled undergrowth of the guerrilla struggles in Guinea-Bissau, to the neon-soaked streets of amnesiac post-war Japan, through the stream of revolutionary movements in Green Without a Cat and the critique of American violence in Iraq in the case of the Grinning Cat. In our own less reflective times, and I say this very, very carefully, and it's not a value judgment, in which periods have become tools of media commodification. Because today, if we think of what's going to happen today in the elections, up is suddenly down, left is now right. And so we have a complete transformation and upending of logic. And I think this is just what we are confronted with. So, and what do we do with these kinds of sweeping changes? I mean, we hear so much, and I'm not here holding brief for Barack Obama, but I think it's very important to to think about the legibility of what our own critical responses to current politics is. So when I say that in our own less reflective times, it's not a judgment to say that we are all disengaged. That's not what I'm saying. But that the structures of communication themselves have the capacity to really transform and change our ability to really be fully engaged with what I would call the anthropological present. So in our own less reflexive times in which periods have become tools of media commodification, fashion, escapism, the 60s is by turns aggrandized and mythologized, both for its breakthroughs in artistic logics and proposals, as well as for its radical political cultures and social experiments. Yet, not all who look back return with lessons for how contemporary art might offer today, through its political and artistic models, practices that are not merely stylistic samplings of the ideological energies operative then, particularly amongst leftist practices. Whether by curators or critics, artists, ideas and works developed during this period of political turmoil in the 60s and world-changing events have become proven repasts, picked apart for insight into how formal aesthetic choices produce radical forms, thus engendering new artistic materials that cater to the market of commodity objects circulated in the name of contemporary art. Again, I want to say very carefully, I'm not trying to say that that the market in itself is a bad thing, but I think that we still have to, hold up to scrutiny the different layers of legitimation and different structures of legitimation at which contemporary art is operating today. So I think it's very important to hold up some of these, spaces or interfaces, so to speak, to more considered public scrutiny. If we are to really have a properly engaged relationship with contemporary art as such. So one wonders and worries then about the critical efficacy of insertions when its remainders are invited into the fetish box of the museum's mummifying and memorial pristineness as merely the carcass of the artistic past, of artistic radicality. Might this encasement and curatorial incarceration not foreclose the radical doubt that attended the project's manifestation in the first place? Might it not be better to return to its original temporal conditions by reasserting the structure of circulation and reception of the work back into the economy of social redistribution when it makes its appearance in London? What I'm trying to comment on is that we receive Meireles' radical work only in an exhibitionary fashion, not in its communicative and disseminatory fashion. So that institutions of such as museums, I think it is their task to through objects to tell the larger stories of art, obviously. But by placing this work in a shelf of display, do we not then disarm its criticality? Has criticality become an object that has both a cultural value, but also has around it accrued what one, not only just simply cultural capital, but economic capital as well? So as I've argued, the 60s is a veritable scene of ceaseless returns. It shows us the potential and the contradictions of contemporary art writ large. It is a good place to start, a place of commencement, the ground from which to write today on the political potential of contemporary art. Since that unruly, unsettled decade continues to loom large, not just because its sensibilities are closer to our own times, but because many of the galvanizing issues of the period, such as illegal wars conducted with impunity and disregard for institutional laws organized, today our own recent experiences. We've seen what is going on with the WikiLeaks and all of that. So you think about the WikiLeaks, you think about the Pentagon Papers, you think about many of the same revelations that happened, in the 60s. It's kind of deja vu. So I think these are the questions that for us are really, important and at stake. So not to speak of the media's uncomplicity in making possible the hegemonic state's assault on democratic values. These are very much a part of our own moral and political atlas today. While the energies and sympathies of third worldism such as Meireles was involved with, were beacons of solidarity in the past. Today, echoes of that solidarity have all but disappeared. Yet the shadow of radical activism and aggressive assertions of sovereignty by the dispossessed that exploded in the 1960s across the world continues to be projected over the field of critical artistic practice, especially in instances where forms of public speech have been stifled in the name of security. Today, the watchword of contemporary reality is security. Everything is now subordinated to the vast apparatus of watching and keeping watch over, a pathology of surveillance that knows no end. Everywhere there is an utterance of concern for public safety, one is likely to find the handprint of official, institutional, extremist, and reactionary discourse haunting the entire field of contemporary culture. In these instances, the emergence of the security state becomes a specter linked to the zone of what I call incarcerated life. It was incarcerated life, particularly of the colonized and subjugated working class, that the radical forces of 1960s activism sought to liberate. The wild processes of unbuilding, toppling, dismantling, raising, protest, civil disobedience, anti-war resistance, urban riots that were the legacy of the politics of contestation and its counter-ideological formations in the 60s were developed specifically as responses to attempts to eradicate the international public sphere, to stifle the speech of the so-called global multitude, which I don't really believe in the global multitude. I think that we have to really, think about how to disaggregate this attempt to homogenize, critique or resistance and so on. So here, crystallizing the politics of resistance and liberation ushered in by the movements of decolonization, anti-imperialism, and civil rights in Africa, Asia, South America, Europe, and the US, this 1960s is today a fable of many forking paths. However, the most insistent and the clearest of his legacies are post-colonial modes of contestation, such as Meireles' work, that transformed the entire international public sphere. These movements produce strategies of rupture that are salient to reading Meireles' procedures of disaggregation. We can see in their conversions implications for cultural and artistic practice that may attempt to constitute an oppositional practice. This makes Meireles' insertions ripe for rediscovery. Though the project was developed at the end of the 1960s, its significance in Brazil at a time of political turmoil and uncertainty that followed the coup d'etat of 1964, when the military took command of the reins of government, and subsequently through social repression and ideological conservatism, asserted control over public institutions, this is relevant to its political and aesthetic efficacy. The work was specifically designed to operate in the interstices of the official spheres of military jingoism, supported by American interventionist politics in the Southern Hemisphere in the guise of anti-communism. From a strict leftist critique of American capitalism and its expansionist imperial project, Insertions employed the classic language of Marxism in fashioning its messages. Already as a young artist, Mireles had begun developing the conceptual and the programmatic language of his work under the shadow of the radical changes and contestations in Brazil and other Latin American countries that were under American-sponsored military dictatorship. So it's very important to look at this body of work and the symbol of Coca-Cola, not just simply merely as a sign of a localist practice, that the gesture of the work itself was really framed, even though that Mireles himself was working in Rio, that the usage of the material itself, it frames a much larger debate that goes beyond Brazil. And I think at this particular point, it's important to also take into account how much the American public might not have been completely aware of the practices of the American government in that part of the world. So over time, artistic responses to regimes of repression and violence across Latin America crystallized into a series of strategies in countries like Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and so on, that made the public sphere the target of their counter-ideological critique of power, violence, imperialism, and capitalism. On a larger level, as with many artists working during this politically charged period, Meireles' work emerged out of another transitional moment in Brazilian art, between the Cartesian logic of neo-concrete abstraction and the expansive performative procedures of conceptual art that was to recast the relationship of contemporary artists to the critical language of social address. The confrontation between politics and modes of social subjectivity would prove a fertile ground for artists intent on elaborating a different course of action in order to make the public sphere relevant and open to everyday life, and as such, to bridge the distance between social practices and artistic experiments. These reflections on the very potential of contemporary art as a site of discursive production, contestation, and sociality produce some of the most engaging and philosophically diverse bodies of work by artists operating in a post-colonial environment. However, Brazil occupies a unique cultural bridge between continents and civilizational spaces, since its artistic heritage is fundamentally linked to Europe, even if on a popular level it is culturally syncretic and, in my view, post-colonial. One attempt to resolve the tension between the Western cultural model and Brazilian popular and vernacular cultures occurred under the interdisciplinary procedures of the Tropicalia movement, which combined popular and experimental forms. Under Tropicalia, the tethers of European artistic avant-garde that served as a model for contemporary artists became more slack. It goes without saying then that Meireles' work is still deeply indebted to the legacy of advanced practices of European avant-garde modernism. In Brazil, his work also belongs fully to the Brazil New Avant-Garde, a period of artistic and cultural transition and regeneration in Brazilian art. However, among the practitioners of his generation, what is most surprising about Meireles' work is its heterogeneity. In his work, seemingly opposing ideological and aesthetic agendas, politics and poetics, aesthetics and anti-aesthetics, form and anti-form, the conceptual and the baroque, are collapsed to produce one of contemporary art's most engaging, unclassifiable practices. Meireles' work is unclassifiable not because there's a lack of consistency in the programmatic orientation of his thinking, but because his formulations of the artistic object bear no relation to a unified artistic style. Each of his works can be approached as a series of monadic units within which the temporal conditions of the work's realization vitiates any notion of continuity in an assembly line of production. In a sense, most of Meireles' work, from the large installations such as the ones I began with to the performative projects, are essentially open-ended projects that change through the accretive process of spatial and temporal expansion and contraction, moving from the context of notes to sketch, to prototype, to fully elaborated exhibitionary manifestation. The absence of continuity between works, however, does not mark a break with the continuity of the philosophical model that animates the sensorial and somatic experiments that have been the key elements of his significant projects. In fact, it is the philosophical and the conceptual, rather than the formal qualities of his style, that link the works together. The last survey of Meireles' work at the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York revealed Meireles as a conceptual chameleon, unlike the precedent set by Elio Oiticica, the work you're looking at, and Ligia Clark, the two giants of contemporary Brazilian art. Yet, at the same time, Meireles' work owes its complex political, social, and conceptual character to the field defined by Oiticica and Clark, both of whom represent two concomitant models of engaged conceptual practice in Brazil in the 1960s. Ortizika's Dionysian spirit and Clark's Apollonian sensibility converge in telling productive ways as they each developed projects that increasingly required the participatory dimension of the audience and public. Mireles, in different turns in his career, has incorporated both of these two aesthetic and social models. Yet, he has remained clearly unlike any of them due to the increasing opacity of some of his own references. But he shares with them a striking quality of new avant-garde Brazilian art of the 60s that saw artists shifting from an aesthetic of form which had inflected the practice of the 1960s with a strict sense of modernist abstraction to a politics of form which sought to bridge the gap between advanced art, Brazilian public culture, and marginal communities. That artists during this period will shift away from the cult of the autonomous commodity objects in order to elaborate a proximity of art as a social object in everyday life, as Ortizika's Parangoles and Clark's performances demonstrated, is not surprising. Art was for empowerment, community, ritual, healing, but it was also crepuscular, as evidenced in the dispersal of fresh carrion across neighborhoods in Alto Barrio's actions, serving as the disturbing reminder of the regime of violence that dominated everyday life in Brazil. With a repressive military dictatorship that was intolerant of dissent and avant-garde procedures, Brazilian culture and politics, like those of many countries in the 60s at the height of decolonization, was reconstituting its claims to modernity in the midst of an indeterminate social experiment across boundaries of class and difference. To alleviate the conservative strictures of Brazilian official cultural classes that oriented artistic investigations towards Europe, artists such as Mireles created radically rigorous series of detours in their work to shatter the vessel of conservative modernist models of artistic practice by combining the aesthetic parameters and sensibility of late modernism with postmodernist and post-colonial structures of practice. In this way, the artists sought solidarity with a broader population of Brazilians across class, ethnicity, and gender. Ortizika's work with the samba schools and with the inhabitants of Rio de Janeiro's favelas represents a structured articulation of what could be called a politics of form. This shift would have important ramifications in the language of artistic production deployed by artists such as Mireles, especially the manner art was moved off the politically compromised parameters of the museum to the contingent conditions of everyday life, social practices, and modes of subjectivization that were coalescing on the streets of Brazil during this period. Against this backdrop of political and social solidarity and the struggle to demilitarize the public sphere, Mireles developed insertions into ideological circuits for the exhibition Information, organized by Keniston McShine at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1970. While Information was a distillation of conceptual artistic practices that emerged in the late 60s internationally, however, with its emphasis on textual messages and communication, it seemed to have been mapping specific ideological ruptures that were noticeable in the political orientations of a number of artists' works in the show, such as Hans Hacker, which is Vietnam Pole, and all the rest of that. Mireles was one such artist. With the Vietnam War and the concerted political repression orchestrated by the Nixon administration against anti-war or dissident activists, including radical political groups in the United States at the time, McShine emphasized and underscored models of communicative action in the work of many artists, including Ortizika, Mireles, Hacker, and others. The question of the responsibility of the artists in response to social and political crises was one of the visible themes of the exhibition. In fact, Information seems clearly a response to the crisis of the public sphere in advanced Western democracies in which information had become a product, a commodity traded and sold, controlled and manipulated by companies, press organizations, and a premium material in the state's ideological struggle with its citizens. In his introduction to the catalogue of the exhibition, McShine was as explicit in targeting the concept of autonomous work of art, especially the traditional painting on canvas, as he was in shining a bright light on the options left for artistic action. For him, information is both material and linguistic, tactical and philosophical, political and ideological. It was the aesthetic equivalent of a cluster bomb. And he wrote, "If you are living in the United States, you may fear that you will be shot at, either in the universities, in your bed, or more formally, in Indochina. It may seem inappropriate, it may seem too inappropriate, if not absurd, to get up in the morning, walk into a room, and apply dabs of paint from a little tube to a square of canvas. What can you do as a young artist that seems relevant and meaningful?" End quote. This was McShine in 1970. Meireles' response to this statement was Insertions. Both currency and commodity, money and Coca-Cola bottle, were adapted into broadcast mediums as tribunes through which the artist can formulate messages, address questions, and organize critiques directed to a broad public that will receive them through the formal cycle of economic transaction and circulation of these instruments of capital and commodity exchange. In the circuit, the messages are received first through the mode of consumption and proliferated through the action of random distribution. The Cildo project and the Coca-Cola project were two of these projects, and they consisted of a series of typographical and linguistic interventions. These interventions were designed as insertions by Mireles, thereby making clear that they were not merely objects of critique, but also part of the structures for that critique. The insertions took the form of rubber stamps for the Cildo project, in which on every currency note spent by Mireles, a question, statement, or slogan was stamped with inscriptions such as, "Who killed Herzog?" A question posed in response to the disappearance and death of a Brazilian journalist under the military dictatorship in Brazil. This sometimes is alternated with the slogan, "Yankees go home," pointing to the opposition and resistance to U.S. imperialism in Latin America. On the reverse side of the currency note, a description of the project as deliberate statement is also stamped. The Coca-Cola project functioned with similarly crafted series of slogans, statements, and declarations screened in white text onto empty Coca-Cola bottles and then returned back into circulation. The statements initially appear invisible when empty, but when refilled at a factory, reveal the embedded message. One such message asks this question: which is the place of art? This is, of course, his form of bad English, but nevertheless. Which is the place of art? Took the direction of the question posed in McShine's introduction. Another screen message on the Coca-Cola bottles employed the following list of terms: Molotov, Pavio, Fita, Adesiva, Basolina. It goes without saying that the allusions of the Coca-Cola bottle as a Molotov cocktail is meant to provoke in the receiver the idea that all political struggles belong in the realm of public discourses of opposition on the streets, in counter-ideological messages, what Meireles calls the dialectical content of the work. To end, the entire scheme of insertion seems to reflect this challenge, especially in its deployment of language as a tool of communicative rupture between the ideological discourse of political repression and the circulatory logic of late capitalist imperialism. McShine's gauntlet and the artist's response to it remain remarkably prescient today. Organized as a series of statements and questions addressing the larger condition of public access to media, Meireles adapted his work through forms of exchange and systems of circulation inherent in the medium of capital and commodity. The specific agenda of Insertions thus operate at the level of social infiltration of the ideological circuits of the state, money, and currency, which the state controls, and unaccountable violence, which the state, jealously guards and places the greatest priority on, and then circuits of consumption controlled by global capital. And for him, this global capital was synonymous with American cultural imperialism, such as Hollywood cinema and all the rest of them. So in his interventions, Meireles' work initiated a radical project of disaggregation, both as a counter-ideological project of political communication and as a critique of the aesthetic commodity of surplus value. But ultimately, Insertions reveals the degree to which historical grounds have proven today the site of ceaseless returns through its structure of circulation, exchange, and circuits. Thank you. I'm sorry if I sort of speed read my talk, but I think we have to sort of make some time for questions and then return to the proper context of this talk, which is a class that we'll have afterwards. But I'm very, very open to questions, comments, or whatever. All right then. I think you should put everything in darkness so people can just simply hide, Okay, go ahead, Andrea. You can kick off.
I didn't want to take it anybody said. I think for me, one aspect that's interesting, maybe just one little aspect of your talk, you unfolded so many. He unfolded so many different aspects. So I'm just kind of posing a simple question around what you mentioned, the way in which you see that exhibitions kind of act as a pacifier of art in a certain way, or there's the trap of...
More like a funnel, not a pacifier, a funnel. It's kind of this, or a strainer. Once you put something through a strainer, you get a much more kind of refined, sediment, if you will. And this is, but go ahead.
But so for me then the question is that I do see that there could be a conflict between actually practice of art and artists and how they kind of perceive and circulate their world, and then how their work, and then how it is actually institutionalized through exhibition spaces. And I wonder, or institutions, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how, as a curator, you work with exactly that problem.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first and foremost, what we are looking at here, it's that when you look at a work like this, it can only exist as a documentation. So we begin with the kind of the self-consciousness of that documentation, and to ask what that self-consciousness really connotes. So it seems to be a work constructed for a future viewer, not a work constructed in the present. So it's already an artifact before the fact. So that, if that is the logic, if we take that as the operative logic of the work, so I have no problem showing that as an artifact. But then we have to make very clear and to ask the question of the effectivity of the gesture, or the effectivity of the assumption that that the work makes of its own power. And let me just simply say this, and I'll say this very, very carefully in relation to something called institutional critique, which you are very familiar with, Andrea, that the notion of institutional critique seems to me to be a work that is utterly, parasitic in its mode of operation. And this is not a criticism, it's a realization of what it is dependent on. So it has a certain kind of sadomasochistic dimension to it, of which the institution, kind of invites the kind of critique by artists to, make them repent their ways and all of those kind of things on the one hand, and the artist kind of taking up the mantle to kind of to perform that task. That is not to say that institutional critique does not have power or does not kind of produce what I call cluster bombs within the institution themselves. But when museums, provide the permission, what they then produce is the condition for the incarceration of the idea. And the curator sort of takes up that problematic to make that legible to the public. Because after all, when you go to quote unquote see an exhibition, to experience an exhibition, you are really going to experience an artifact that is in the guise of objects of art. And there is, and when I say this, it's not a disrespect to the objects of art. I personally love working with objects of art. I love working with artists. So all of those kind of things that curators do are very important to me. But I think at a certain level, when I look at Meireles' insertions into ideological circuits, the problem opens up, or the question that one needs to ask is, what are we presenting? These Coca-Cola bottles. So we see it as kind of in a series of very, discrete, objects, whereas in the way in which they function, they were much more fugitive, much more, unorganized in the kind of communication that it might produce and the kind of responses the work might elicit from the receiver. And all of those things are lost in the context of display. I'm just trying to sort of to make that shift, to point to that fact that it's important for us to keep that in mind. Because I don't want to seem like as if I'm over-valorizing this kind of radicality, which in a sense kind of ends up in the museum. Yes?
I'm just going to follow that logic a little bit. It would then beg the question of whether the reinsertion of a reinsertion is possible as a museum practice. Would it be a placebo? Would it be a symptomatic re-expression? If, in fact, the circulation of the bottles were not on a shelf in a museum, but were redistributed in the way or manner, or in a new way or manner, that would not replicate its primary task as an artifact, but reinsert it as an artifactual practice.
Yeah.
So I'm just suggesting there might be a museal paradox.
Yeah. Well, in fact, it is a museal paradox. And by saying that, it does not necessarily make the work ineffective. But what it does is that it shrinks its possible landscape of operation, you see. Whereas before the landscape was more capacious, right? Here it is much more delimited. And it's not only delimited, it's also delimited by the language of reception attached to the work, according to how museums operate. So you have a label that tells you the story and all of that. So those are, again, very difficult things to reconcile with works that are inherently temporal operations rather than physical things as such. So is it a placebo? I think, yeah, that's a very interesting question to sort of to ask. But I am particularly interested in that simply because and James Meyer really wrote a very insightful essay around this question of the return of the 60s as a model, that the 60s as a sort of medium of expression. So that in a sense, the 60s, that people want to be the barricades in May '68, but not, through the kind of metonymic aspect of that. So these are the, the questions that one have to really, look at carefully. So I became interested in this simply because, I wrote this piece in the context of Meireles' retrospective at the Tate Modern, for which I was a contributor to the catalog, and because I wanted to also to question, to link this notion of ceaseless returns to the concept of the retrospective, and so on. So anyway, so it was much more like a kind of a number of thought experiments on the possible reception and thinking of a historical work after the conditions under which it was made and the conditions that provoked it had disappeared. So if you were to recirculate the bottle and say, Yankees go home, it would seem so anachronistic, because today we say death to America. You have to be more, forceful, something much more violent, death to America. That's what, that would be more current language rather than Yankees go home. It doesn't really have the same impact. You see what I mean? Yes.
When I look at these Coca-Cola bottles, I feel that some of the power in his work comes from the creation of a new space, a mediating space, I guess, between these economic and political structures of power and the powerless people that he represented and that he was speaking for. So in creating that new mediating space, I feel that that's part of what makes the work really powerful.
Yeah.
My own work right now deals with Nigeria, and so there are many examples of this throughout the global south where the difference between the power structures on the top there's a discrepancy between what's on top and what's on bottom. So being that there are no mediating structures, I feel that you can find many examples of this in different countries through the global south.
Yes.
My question though is, it's related to here, New York or the West, in this specific time. And I was wondering what you thought in terms of whether this type of work is possible in our society and in our time, being that the discrepancy between the top and the bottom maybe it isn't as large or it's different in nature or more powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I think this type of work is certainly, possible and is really ongoing. I think that to lend to credence to some of the things you've been mentioning. I mean, there's a broad, space in which such work, as Mireles has been kind of seen. The return of the 60s, I would like to also say, it's not only just simply people like Rene Green and all these people. You think about Sam Durant, and that a lot of this work sometimes function at the level of what I call the citational, right? As a way to sort of to provoke other kinds of reflections that may lead to the sort of lengthening of the lexicon of dispute, within the structure of art. I mean, we've seen, you think about somebody like Thomas Hershon. I mean, there are many artists who obviously are deeply engaged. I am not saying that a painter who paints abstract frames is not deeply engaged. This is not what I'm advocating. I'm saying that those kinds of very explicit works that have political dimension to them, that oftentimes what it seems to me that this return to the 60s is an attempt to sort of to hold on to some kind of hallowed ground when it seemed that everything was possible. Maybe it was because that the 60s generated so many moments of disaggregation with the liberation movements in Asia, in Africa, and so on. That you can say concretely that there were so many things that happened in the 60s that made it possible for artists of all different stripes to really use politics in a particularly, sharp way. Whether these works are, again, when we look at when these works go through the filter of curatorial methodology and institutional legitimation, something else entirely emerges. So we really have to, deal with that, come to terms with that. How does the artist develop projects that not necessarily to resist, but that can have an afterlife beyond that process of filtering that occurs? You need that filtering also as a way of also clarifying, contradictions that may also be inherent in the work itself. Just simply because the work of art doesn't give it every license that it seeks to, keep for itself. But I think that's at least the beginning of that. I don't know if it answers your question, but that's, yeah.
It was really interesting to hear you talk about this project in the politics of form.
Mm.
I think you did a really excellent job in talking about how the form is something that's really fugitive. But I'm wondering to what extent the politics are also fugitive, right? When you think about the politics of form being about the disaggregation of large, powerful discourses of various kinds. So thinking about what kind of a politics this is, I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about what kind of participatory experience is imagined in the circulation of these things, and to what extent they might work to disaggregate the audience as well.
Yeah, well, I think what I did not really dwell on, and it's a part that I completely cut out of my text because it's not really essential to my larger discussion, is the work of Oiticica, linked with the work of Augusto Boal with the Theater of the Oppressed, and the Paulo Freire with the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. All of these projects emerged at a particular moment. And I think it's very interesting when we look at the so-called educational turn in contemporary art today, that was a moment when, teach-ins and all of those kind of community education, had a very, very important dialectical content, if I'll use Meireles' own notion to sort of to think this moment. So when we look at Oiticica and Clark, the Samba schools, the Parangoles, here the artists were no longer, if you think under a dictatorship, and under the rubric of conceptual art of the 60s, one thinks about the dematerialization of the object of art. You would think that in a place like Brazil, that was not the pressing question. It would have been the rematerialization of space. So by leaving the museum through the Samba schools, through the Parangoles, this kind of performative, this kind of carnival, the first, here we may use festivalism in more positive terms than Peter Scherdor will use it. The festivalist dimension of Oiticica, Clark, and the more idiosyncratic, festivalist process of Mireles as a very interesting way to disaggregate space, to sort of to open it up, to have the space itself embodied and the object of art itself also embodied. So there's a kind of somatic dimension to the work of art that these artists were trying to articulate at this particular time, in which physicality meant something. It was not just simply a cube in front of you, Michael Fried and all of that, mumbo jumbo of the whatever. I mean, it was a great article, don't get me wrong, but I'm just sort of,
So, I'm just wondering what extent you might want to pull a project like this apart from those other ones, because it seems in its form to be less collective than you would encounter.
Yeah, it's much more discrete. It's much more discrete. It does not, seek to impose itself on the space. It's really entirely on that really level of dissemination and communication, rather on the attempt to, to produce space. And in fact, I think I would agree with the last comment that there is a dimension of spatialization that occurs, but at this very small level of the transaction that one makes with these materials. Yeah, Luca.
I have a question which, even though more anecdotal, comparing to your analysis of the political consciousness that these interventions do, deals with the insertion into a system of legislation. And basically, I'm thinking a comparison with the Japanese artist, forgot his name. He was part of this high right center. He falsified banknotes, and he was had to face a trial and lost. Are you familiar if Cildo Mireles haven't had any inquisition, any interrogation, or any response from the institution that he was criticizing for this, despite discreet yet point?
Whether he had problems?
Well, yes.
Not that I know of. I think for many artists that would be the ideal situation. It sharpens the engagement, I would say. I don't know, but I don't even know if that is absolutely necessary for the effectiveness of the work or the thinking of the work. But I do certainly take your point about the charges against the Japanese artist. I don't remember his name either. Shiraga something, I don't remember, but in any case, it goes to the last point I was making at the end of my talk, which is that there are two domains in which state power in one's absolute monopoly, and that is the monopoly of violence, through defense and whatever, and the monopoly of value. How it regulates value. The currency is one significant, medium through which such transactions are regulated. So legally, if you print your own currency in order to to create a value outside of the legislated value, if you will, then you fall afoul of the law. And I think this is why that this relationship with the institution of value is a very interesting one. And we mustn't forget that in the 60s, this was a very big question for many artists at Cildo, and so all of these questions really meant something really not merely economic in terms of what artists were interested in, but also political and cultural. So this work operates on all these different levels across his existence, which was very, very short period. After information, it became a museum piece, so to speak. Okay, one more.
I just had a question for clarification. I wanted to ask you where you say the location of meanings in the work.
The location of what?
The location of meaning in his work, in a work like this. Is the meaning in the act of the insertion? Is it generated through currency, through the circuit, or is it as we see now the documentation of it, which you answered earlier?
Well, again, perhaps I think with what I ended with, that this is part of the paradox of a work like this. I'm not so much speaking about the meaning of the work as much as I'm interested in the structure of its reception and distribution and so on. So we have two parts here: the work and the afterlife of the work, the afterlife through documentation and so on. And there I talked about the self-consciousness of the work, because it knows that its existence will be purely on the basis of the kind of the archival reproduction of it. So you get somebody to photograph, the hand stamping the work. So there has to be some kind of evidence that something happened. but there's no quantifiable way that we can really use to detect how widely the work itself was, how widely the objects and the currencies circulated. But that's not really important. What is for me more important is the conception of the idea, the potentiality of the work. For me, that's where the rub really, lies. Okay, thank you so much.